The wagon lurched forward with a groan of timber and iron, and Frederick Holloway's entire world narrowed to the sight of Mary Monroe's rigid back as she sat on that buckboard seat, reins gripped in her white-knuckled hands, her jaw set like carved stone against the blinding Arizona afternoon. She was leaving. She was actually leaving, and everything inside him that had been silent and buried and locked away for 3 years rose up with such ferocity that he did not think, did not calculate, did not weigh the consequences the way he always did. He simply moved. His boots hit the dry earth hard as he pushed off the porch steps and crossed the yard in 6 long strides, and when his hand caught the bridle of her lead horse, the animal startled and planted its hooves, and the wagon stopped with a violent jolt that nearly threw Mary from her seat. "Frederick Holloway, you let go of that horse this instant." Her voice was a blade, sharp and cold, and trembling at the edges with something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was absolutely both. He did not let go. He stood there in the dust and the heat with his hand on the bridle, and his chest heaving and his gray eyes fixed on her face. And he said the words that had been strangling him from the inside since the moment he overheard her conversation with Dorothea Vance in the general store 3 days ago. The words he had not been able to speak because speaking them meant tearing open every hidden truth he had spent years burying under hard work and silence, and the kind of loneliness that becomes its own familiar companion. "You are not leaving without knowing the truth." Mary's face, that beautiful, furious, heartbroken face, went absolutely still. The Arizona sun hammered down on the Hollow Creek Ranch yard, indifferent to the storm happening between these two human beings, and somewhere behind them a horse in the far pasture called out, and the windmill near the well creaked in the dry summer wind, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath. "What truth?" she said finally, and her voice had dropped from a blade to something much more dangerous. Something quiet, something that meant she was close to the edge of something she could not take back. Frederick Holloway was 31 years old. He had built this ranch with his own hands from a burned-out homestead claim that nobody else wanted. He had buried his father on this land and kept his younger brother out of prison on this land, and paid off a debt to a dangerous man on this land. And he had done all of it without asking a single person for help or sympathy or understanding. He was not a man who spoke easily about interior things. He was not a man who had ever in his adult life stood in a dusty yard and stopped a woman's wagon because the thought of her leaving was more unbearable than any physical pain he had ever endured. But here he was, and the truth he was about to speak had the power to either save everything between them or destroy it entirely. He needed to go back. He needed to explain how they had arrived at this moment, because the truth was not a single statement. It was a long, complicated, fiercely guarded story, and Mary Monroe deserved every word of it. It had begun 11 months ago, on a September morning in 1883, when the stagecoach from Tucson rolled into the small town of Callan's Creek, Arizona Territory, and deposited 4 passengers into the red dust of Main Street. 3 of them were men who promptly disappeared into the saloon. The 4th was a woman in a dark green traveling dress with a battered trunk and a carpet bag, and the kind of composure that suggests a person has been holding themselves together through an act of sheer, sustained will for a very long time. Mary Monroe was 26 years old, and she had come to Callan's Creek because she had nowhere else to go. That was the plain truth of it, though she would have described her situation differently and in considerably more dignified terms if asked. She would have said she had come to take the position of schoolteacher at the Callan's Creek schoolhouse, which was true. She would have said she had accepted the position after the previous teacher, a Mr. Aldous Finch, had departed for California mid-semester, which was also true. What she would not have said, at least not to a stranger, was that she had left Cincinnati, Ohio, with $47, a teaching certificate, and the desperate need to put 2,000 miles between herself and the man who had stood at the altar of St. Michael's Church and chosen, at the last possible moment, not to show up. His name had been Cornelius Albright, and he had been everything a woman of Mary Monroe's social position was supposed to want. He came from money. He was educated. He was handsome in a soft, constructed sort of way. And he had courted her for 2 years with flowers and theater tickets and letters full of beautiful, soaring language. And then on the morning of their wedding, he had sent his manservant with a note that said simply that he had changed his mind and gone to New York. Mary had stood in the church vestibule in her wedding dress and read that note and then folded it very carefully and put it in her reticule and walked out of the church and gone directly home and begun to pack. She had not cried. Not then. The crying had come later, in the privacy of her room in the dark, when there was no one to witness it and she could afford to let the betrayal of it, the utter humiliation and heartbreak of it, come through her like a tide. And when it was done, she had washed her face and looked at herself in the mirror and made a decision that the rest of her life was going to be entirely different from the first 25 years of it. She was going west. The schoolhouse in Callens Creek was a single-room building with a warped floor and a smoky stove, and 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and Mary loved it from the first morning. She loved the straightforwardness of children. She loved that they wanted things simply and clearly stated. She loved that when she was standing at the front of that room with chalk in her hand, she was entirely in command of herself and entirely useful. And there was no room in that state of being for grief or humiliation or the dark question of whether she was, at her core, the kind of woman that men ultimately left. She found rooms to board with a widow named Agnes Tull, who had a clean house and excellent coffee, and a sharp, unsentimental manner that Mary found refreshing after a lifetime of Cincinnati society and its endless performance of gentle emotions. Agnes Tull said exactly what she meant and did not soften it, and in those first difficult weeks of adjustment to the territory, that directness was a gift. It was Agnes Tull who first mentioned Frederick Holloway. "The big ranch east of town," Agnes said one evening in October, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in colors that Mary still could not entirely believe were real. "Hollow Creek Ranch. Frederick Holloway runs it. Has done for 6 years since his father died. He comes into town maybe once a month for supplies, never stays longer than he has to. Decent man. Solitary as a stone, but decent." "Why is he so solitary?" Mary asked, because she was a schoolteacher and asking questions was something she did reflexively. Agnes looked at her with those sharp gray eyes and said, "Because solitary is what happens to a man when the world gives him enough reasons to be careful." Mary had filed that away and thought nothing more of it. She met Frederick Holloway for the first time in the first week of November, when he came into the Callens Creek General Store, while she was there arranging for the delivery of paper and ink for the schoolhouse. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair gone a little long and gray eyes that were startling in their directness. He wore his working clothes, canvas trousers and a heavy flannel shirt and boots worn to comfort, and he moved through the store with the economy of motion that belongs to men who do physical work and have no patience for gestures that serve no purpose. He did not notice her at first, which was fine. He was placing an order with the store's proprietor, Mr. Hendricks, in a low, clear voice, and Mary was listening without meaning to, because his voice had a quality of absolute conviction that she found impossible not to pay attention to. Then Hendricks said, "Miss Monroe, you've not met Frederick Holloway yet, have you?" And the man turned and looked at her, and for one brief, startling moment their eyes met with the kind of directness that usually takes months of acquaintance to achieve. "Miss Monroe," Frederick said, and tipped his hat. "Mr. Holloway," she said. That was all. He completed his order, collected his receipts, and left. Mary went back to arranging for her paper and ink and told herself firmly that gray eyes and a good voice were not remarkable things, and she should not behave as though they were. But she thought about him on the walk home. November passed into December, and the desert cold was a different animal from Cincinnati cold, drier and sharper, and arriving suddenly in the evenings like a door slamming. The children at the school were making good progress. 3 of the older ones had arrived barely able to read and were now working through McGuffey's second reader with real confidence, and Mary felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered. Frederick Holloway came into town twice in November and once in early December, and each time their paths crossed in the way that paths cross in a town of 400 people, briefly, with a nod or a word, and each time Mary was aware of the particular quality of attention he gave her. It was not intrusive. It was not the kind of attention that made a woman feel observed or catalogued. It was more like the attention of someone who is genuinely interested in whether another person is doing well, and expresses that interest by simply, quietly noticing. December brought a hard week of rain, unusual enough in the territory to be remarked upon by everyone, and it was during that week that the schoolhouse roof developed a leak significant enough to make teaching impossible. The territorial school board, which operated with the efficiency of a committee run by men who had other priorities, was unlikely to authorize repairs before January at the earliest. Mary was standing in front of the closed schoolhouse door in the gray December rain, contemplating the problem with the focus of someone who has learned that problems do not solve themselves, when she heard hooves on the road and looked up to see Frederick Holloway pulling his horse to a stop. "Schoolhouse roof," he said, looking at the water streaming from the eaves. "Yes," she said, "the board will not move quickly." He looked at the building for a moment, then looked at her, and something shifted very slightly in his expression. "I can fix a roof," he said, "if you want." She looked at him steadily. "I would not want to impose." "You're not imposing," he said. "I'm offering." He came the next morning with timber and nails and a ladder, and he worked for most of the day while Mary, because she could not simply stand and watch a person do physical labor on her behalf without contributing something, swept out the water damage and reorganized the supply shelves and made coffee on the small stove that, unlike the roof, still functioned perfectly. He came in at midday for the coffee and sat at one of the children's desks, which looked faintly absurd given his height, and drank it in silence for a moment before saying, "This is a good school." "Thank you," she said. "Children are learning. They are, quickly. They're motivated because their parents want them to do well, and that makes an enormous difference." He nodded, looking at the slates lined up on the shelf, the maps tacked to the walls, the careful order of the room. "Didn't have much schooling myself," he said. "Some. Enough to read and do numbers. My father taught me most of what I needed." "What did your father teach you?" she asked, and it was a genuine question, not conversational filler. He looked at her as though the genuineness of it surprised him slightly. "How to read land," he said. "How to read weather. How to build things that last. How to be honest when it costs you something." The last item on that list sat in the warm air of the schoolroom for a moment. "Those are important things," Mary said quietly. "Yes," he said, "they are." He finished the roof that afternoon, and when he came down from the ladder for the last time and stood in the schoolyard dusting the sawdust from his hands, Mary said, "What do I owe you, Mr. Holloway?" Because she was not the kind of woman who accepted gifts without acknowledging them as such. He shook his head. "Nothing." "That is not an acceptable answer," she said. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "Dinner," he said, "if Mrs. Tull is willing. I haven't had a meal I didn't cook myself in a long time." Agnes Tull was willing, and considerably more than willing, in the way of a woman who has observed 2 interesting people and decided that they should know each other better and is prepared to facilitate this. She made a roast and biscuits and a dried apple pie that was extraordinary by any standard, and the 3 of them sat at her kitchen table, and Mary watched Frederick Holloway relax, incrementally, the way a structure settles when the load it's been under is carefully redistributed. He talked about the ranch, not boastfully, but with the quiet love of a man describing something he has given his life to. Hollow Creek Ranch was 340 acres of grassland and scrub on the eastern edge of the Callens Creek Valley, running cattle and a small horse breeding operation. His father had built the main house in 1869. The creek that gave the ranch its name ran year-round in the western corner of the property, which was unusual in that landscape and invaluable. He had been working the land since he was 15 years old. "Do you ever get lonely?" Mary asked, and then immediately felt that it might have been too direct a question. But he didn't flinch from it. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her, and said, "Every day." She had not expected that kind of honesty. It arrived so cleanly and without self-pity that it rearranged something in her chest. "Then why stay?" she asked. "Because it's mine," he said simply, "and because I don't know how to walk away from something I've given everything to." She understood that. She understood it with the specific comprehension of someone who had given themselves entirely to something and had that investment repaid with abandonment, and had then chosen, rather than withdraw from life, to give themselves entirely to something else. She understood the logic of total commitment as a response to loss. They did not discuss any of that. But something in the quality of the silence after his words suggested they both knew, in the private way of people who have been through damage, that the other had been through it too. January came, and with it the resumption of school and the new year, and a particular evening in mid-January that Mary would think about for a very long time afterward. She had been invited to a small gathering at the home of Dr. and Mrs. Cavendish, who hosted a monthly dinner for the handful of people in Callan's Creek who constituted what Agnes Tull called, with magnificent dryness, the cultural element. This included the preacher, a young attorney named Beaumont who had come from Dallas 2 years prior, the doctor and his wife, Agnes herself, and that month, Frederick Holloway, whom Dr. Cavendish had invited specifically because he wanted to discuss a proposal to extend the irrigation ditch that ran through the eastern quarter of the valley and needed Holloway's opinion on the gradient of his land. After the dinner in the Cavendish's parlor, while the others were engaged in a conversation about the proposed territorial railroad, Mary and Frederick found themselves at the far end of the room near the bookshelf, and somehow, without either of them engineering it, they were talking quietly and with extraordinary ease for nearly an hour. They talked about books. He had read more than she had assumed, borrowing from a lending library in Tucson on his occasional trips there. He had read Dickens and Twain and, unexpectedly, George Eliot, whose middle mark he had found in his words, uncomfortably accurate about the way people build their lives around ideas of themselves instead of the truth. "What truth?" she asked, and it was a question she asked out of literary interest, not personal prying. He looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "The truth of what they actually want versus what they've told themselves they're supposed to want." She thought about Cornelius Albright standing her up at the altar. She thought about 2 years of theater tickets and soaring letters, and a man who had, in the end, told himself a story about who he was that she had never actually been a character in. "Yes," she said, "I understand that distinction very well." February arrived with a warmth that the desert offered sometimes as a small, fraudulent hint of spring, and it was in February that the friendship between Mary Monroe and Frederick Holloway became something that both of them were privately aware was not quite accurately described as friendship. He found reasons to come into town more frequently. She found that she looked up whenever the door of the general store opened to see if it was him. He brought her a book from Tucson, a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that he handed to her in the street with the matter-of-fact abruptness of a man who is performing an emotional gesture and does not want to make more of it than necessary. She read it in 2 evenings and wrote him a note, delivered through Hendricks at the store, detailing the specific poem she had found most moving and why. He appeared at her door the following Saturday to discuss the note. They sat on Agnes Tull's porch in the February warmth for 3 hours and talked about beauty and endurance, and the strange courage required to write honestly about things that are interior and therefore invisible, and therefore considered, by much of the world, to be unreal. Agnes Tull watched this from the kitchen window with the satisfaction of a general whose strategy is proceeding exactly as planned. March brought the moment when the almost became something. It happened on an afternoon when Frederick had given Mary a tour of Hollow Creek Ranch, which she had asked for out of genuine curiosity after everything he had told her about it. And they had walked the boundary of the creek pasture in the late afternoon light, and the land had been extraordinary. The grass new green and the creek running clear, and the mountains beyond the valley rimmed in gold. And they had stopped at the same moment to watch a pair of red-tailed hawks riding the thermals above the ridge. Standing side by side, their arms not quite touching, Mary had looked up at the hawks and then sideways at Frederick's profile and felt something so clear and certain and terrifying that she had immediately looked away again. He had turned to look at her at almost the same moment. Neither of them spoke. The hawks circled. The creek ran. The late light made the grass gold and the shadows long, and in that silence Mary could feel her own heartbeat with remarkable clarity. Then a cow in the far pasture bellowed about something, and the moment broke and they both stepped back slightly and began talking about the irrigation proposal. And the rest of the afternoon was fine and perfectly ordinary, and absolutely charged with everything that had not been said. She went home that evening and sat in her room and had a long, stern conversation with herself. She had come to Arizona to build a life that was entirely her own. She had come here precisely to stop depending on the idea of being wanted by a man as the organizing principle of her existence. She was a school teacher. She had students who were learning. She had a purpose and an income and a place in this community, and she did not need to complicate all of that with feelings for a man who was, she reminded herself firmly, solitary by deep habit, and as far as she could tell, not the kind of person who moved easily toward emotional disclosure. All of which was entirely rational and completely correct, and made absolutely no difference whatsoever to what she felt. April was when things began to go wrong, though she did not know it yet. There was a man in Callan's Creek named Silas Vance. He was perhaps 50 years old, with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being the most consequential person in any given room. He owned the largest general merchandise operation in the county and had substantial interests in a proposed land deal that involved several ranches in the Eastern Valley, including, she would eventually learn, Hollow Creek Ranch. Silas Vance had a wife named Dorothea, who was 10 years younger than him and considerably sharper, and it was Dorothea who had first introduced herself to Mary at the church social in October, and who had thereafter made a point of stopping by the schoolhouse occasionally with small gifts of baked goods that were gestures of friendliness that Mary accepted at face value, because she had no reason not to. What Mary did not know, and what would eventually become the central engine of the crisis between her and Frederick, was that Silas Vance was in the process of attempting to acquire Hollow Creek Ranch through a combination of financial pressure and social manipulation, and that Frederick Holloway, who was aware of this and actively resisting it, had a dark history with Silas Vance that predated the current land situation by 12 years. In 1871, when Frederick was 19 years old and his father was still alive, his younger brother Daniel Holloway had gotten into a serious gambling debt with Silas Vance, who at that time had been running a card room in the town of Mesa Flat, 40 miles south of Callan's Creek. The debt had been $200, which was a significant sum, and Vance had made it clear that he intended to collect it by whatever means were available to him if Daniel Holloway did not pay. Frederick, who was fiercely protective of his brother and aware that their father could not know the details without it killing him, had paid the debt himself by selling a parcel of Hollow Creek's best pasture land to a neighbor for $210. A sale his father had never fully understood and which Frederick had never explained. Vance had taken the money and before leaving Mesa Flat for good the following year, had ensured that the loss of that parcel of land was recorded in a document that he had since kept in his possession, a document that, depending on how it was interpreted and by whom, could be construed as evidence of an unpaid mortgage rather than a completed land sale. This interpretation was incorrect, and Frederick believed, legally untenable. But Vance was patient, and Vance had money, and Vance had been quietly building toward a moment when the document would be most useful. That moment, it turned out, had something to do with Mary Monroe. The scheme was subtle enough that Mary would have felt ashamed of herself for not seeing it, once she understood it. Dorothea Vance's friendliness had not been random. Dorothea, who was either a willing participant in her husband's manipulations or a woman so thoroughly under his influence that the distinction barely mattered, had been cultivating Mary's trust specifically because Silas Vance had identified Mary as a lever. His logic was cold and practical. Frederick Holloway was a man who had been alone for years and who was, by April of 1884, visibly if quietly involved with the new schoolteacher. If the schoolteacher could be persuaded to believe something sufficiently damaging about Frederick, she would leave. And a man who had just lost the first woman he had cared about in years was a man whose judgment and resistance would be significantly compromised, which was exactly the condition in which Silas Vance wanted Frederick Holloway when the conversation about the land deal came. What Dorothea told Mary, on the afternoon of the 3rd of June in the Callens Creek General Store, was this: that Frederick Holloway had once been engaged to a woman named Clara Brent, who had come out from Kansas to marry him in 1880, and that Clara Brent had left Hollow Creek Ranch 3 months after arriving under circumstances that the town had never fully understood, but that involved, according to Dorothea, Frederick losing his temper in a manner that had frightened Clara badly enough that she had taken the first stage out of Callens Creek and never looked back. Dorothea delivered this with an expression of genuine reluctance and what appeared to be authentic concern, and she said she had hesitated for months about whether to say anything, and had finally decided that Mary deserved to know, as a woman alone in a territory far from home and anyone who could protect her. Mary had stood very still in the general store and listened to every word with the controlled composure she had developed in that Cincinnati vestibule 3 years ago, the composure that meant she was hearing something that was doing significant damage, and she was not going to let anyone see exactly how much. She had said, "Thank you for telling me, Dorothea," in a voice that revealed nothing, and she had completed her purchases and walked home and sat in her room for a long time. The thing was, she could imagine it. That was the trap's real cruelty. She could imagine it because she had been, 3 years ago, a woman abandoned by a man she trusted, and because the specific fear that Dorothea's story activated was not a new fear but an old wound reopened with surgical precision. She had trusted a man completely once, and he had revealed himself at the worst possible moment to be someone other than who she had believed him to be. The idea that she might be doing it again, that Frederick's silences and his solitary ways and his guardedness might conceal not admirable reserve but dangerous temper, was not an idea she could dismiss without effort. And here was the darker part of the trap. She had not asked Frederick about Clara Brent. She had known that Clara Brent had existed because Agnes Tull had mentioned her once in passing, in the earliest weeks, simply noting that there had been a young woman from Kansas who had come out and found territory life not to her liking and gone back east. Agnes had not suggested anything alarming. Agnes had framed it as an ordinary incompatibility. But Dorothea's version was something else entirely. Mary spent 3 days with Dorothea's words, turning them over, testing them, trying to see them clearly. She told herself to go to Frederick and ask him directly. She told herself that secrets and hidden motives were best addressed by simple, honest questions. She had nearly talked herself into doing exactly that when she arrived at Hollow Creek Ranch on the morning of the 6th of June, ostensibly to return a volume of Dickens she had borrowed, and overheard, through the open window of the ranch house, Frederick speaking to a man inside. The man was his ranch hand, a steady Texan named Pete Carver, and Frederick was saying in a very quiet, very controlled voice, "Vance is pushing harder. He came by yesterday when I was out with Pete checking the north fence. Left a note. He's saying the sale of the south parcel in 71 wasn't recorded correctly and he's going to take it to a judge in Tucson. Carver's response was inaudible. Frederick said, "I know. But if it goes to Tucson, it becomes a public matter, and then everything about Daniel comes out, and I cannot let that happen. I've kept that buried for 13 years, and I will keep it buried." She had stood outside the window for a moment longer than she should have, and then stepped back quietly and walked back down the lane to the road and kept walking. Secrets. He had secrets. There was something buried, something he had been hiding for 13 years, and it involved his brother and it involved Silas Vance, and he had never, in all their months of friendship and evenings on porches and conversations about books and hawks and the truth of what people actually want, mentioned any of it. She went home and she sat and she thought. She thought about the fact that she had left Cincinnati to escape the hidden motives and secret reservations of a man she had trusted. She thought about standing in a church vestibule reading a note that said he had changed his mind. She thought about how that felt, and she thought about Frederick's voice saying he would keep it buried, and about Dorothea's story about Clara Brent, and about the compound weight of all of it settling on her chest. She made a decision. She told Agnes Tull that evening that she had sent a letter of inquiry to the school board in Prescott, Arizona Territory's capital, which was looking for an experienced teacher. She said she was considering a change. She said the opportunity in Prescott was a meaningful professional advancement. Agnes Tull said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Mary Monroe, running away from something never feels like running away until you look back and see the distance." Mary said, "I'm not running away. I'm making a rational professional decision." Agnes looked at her with those sharp eyes and said nothing further, which was, in its own way, the loudest possible response. The reply from Prescott came 5 days later with an offer of the position. Mary accepted it by return post. She told Hendricks at the general store, and the preacher, and Dr. Cavendish, and she arranged for the removal of her trunk and her carpetbag from Agnes Tull's house. She hired a wagon to take her to the stage stop at Mesa Flat, where she would connect to the Prescott stage. She did not go to Hollow Creek Ranch. She told herself she would write Frederick a letter from Prescott. She told herself that a clean departure was better than a conversation in which she might say things she could not unsay. She told herself a great many things that were all, at their core, the very same thing. She was afraid. She was afraid that if she stood in front of Frederick Holloway and looked at his face, she would not be able to leave, and she was more afraid of trusting him and being wrong than she was of the loneliness of leaving. The morning of the 15th of June arrived bright and merciless. She said goodbye to Agnes Tull, who held her hands for a long moment and looked at her with an expression that said everything Agnes Tull had decided not to say out loud. She climbed into the hired wagon. The driver, a young man named Tom Garvey, clicked to the horses, and they moved out of Callan's Creek heading south on the Mesa Flat Road. The road to Mesa Flat ran east of Hollow Creek Ranch for about 2 miles before curving away south, and Mary was sitting straight and composed on the buckboard, and not allowing herself to look east, not allowing herself to think about the green pastures or the creek, or the red-tailed hawks or gray eyes that saw her with a directness no one had ever quite managed before. And she had nearly talked herself into believing she was entirely all right when she heard hooves. Fast hooves coming from the east, from the direction of the ranch. She turned her head before she could stop herself, and she saw Frederick Holloway riding hard across the flat scrubland between the ranch gate and the road. And something in the way he rode, not the controlled canter of a man going about business, but the flat-out urgency of a man in the grip of something he cannot contain, made her chest tighten with a feeling she absolutely refused to name. He reached the road 30 yards ahead of them and pulled his horse sideways across it. And Tom Garvey hauled the wagon horses to a stop and looked sideways at Mary with the wide-eyed expression of someone who is abruptly uncertain what kind of situation he has found himself in. Frederick came around to the side of the wagon and took the bridle of the lead horse, and when Mary said, in the coldest voice she could manage, "Frederick Holloway, you let go of that horse this instant," he looked up at her with gray eyes that were raw with something she had never seen in them before and said the words, "You are not leaving without knowing the truth." And now they were here, in this stopped moment in the June heat with the wagon between them and everything unspoken filling the air like a physical force. "What truth?" she said quietly. He let go of the horse's bridle. He stood in the road. He took a breath that she could see cost him something, and he began. "Clara Brent," he said. Mary went very still. "Whatever you heard about Clara Brent," he said, "I want you to know the real account of it. Clara came out from Kansas in March of 1880. We had corresponded through a matrimonial notice she responded to, which I placed because I was 27 years old and I had been alone on this land for 4 years, and I thought the loneliness was something I could fix by the straightforward means of finding a wife. Clara was a good woman. She was honest and hardworking, and she deserved better than I gave her." He paused. "She left because I was not capable at that time of being present with another person, not because I frightened her. Not because of any temper or violence or behavior that should alarm you. She left because I worked from before dawn to after dark and spoke less than a man in a monastery, and when she tried to talk to me about it, I did not know how to respond in any way that was useful to her. And after 3 months she told me plainly that she had not come 2,000 miles to be lonely in a different state, and she packed her trunk and got on the stage, and I did not stop her because I knew she was right." Mary looked at him. "I did not stop her," he said again, very carefully, "because stopping her would have meant holding her to something I was not giving her. I'm telling you this because whatever you heard about that situation was wrong, and I need you to know that." "Who told you what I heard?" she said. "Agnes Tull," he said. "She came out to the ranch this morning. She said Dorothea Vance had been to see you. She said you were leaving. She said if I had any business with you I had better attend to it." Agnes Tull. Mary felt a complicated rush of gratitude and exasperation toward the sharp-eyed widow that was almost enough to make her smile in other circumstances. "And Silas Vance," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What about him?" "I came to return your Dickens on the 6th of June, she said. "I overheard what you said to Pete Carver. About the land, about something buried for 13 years, about not letting it come out." The effect of this on Frederick was significant. His expression, which had been open and urgent, closed slightly, and she saw him wrestling with something, and she watched him win. "My brother Daniel," he said. "In 1871 he ran up a gambling debt with Silas Vance, who was running a card room in Mesa Flat at the time. $200. Vance was going to hurt him to collect it. I paid the debt by selling a piece of our south pasture to our neighbor Hadley. My father never knew why I sold it. He went to his grave thinking I sold that land to raise capital for the cattle operation, which is the story I told him, because the truth would have broken something in him that I couldn't bear to break." He paused. "The thing I've been keeping buried all these years is Daniel's part in it, because it was Daniel's shame, not mine to share. Vance is now claiming that the sale of that parcel wasn't properly recorded and that he holds a prior interest in it. He's wrong. I have the deed and the transfer documents, and my attorney in Tucson has reviewed them and is confident we can defend the title. But Vance is using it as leverage because he wants Hollow Creek Ranch, or rather he wants the water rights that come with the creek, because there's a land development consortium forming in Tucson that's interested in this valley, and the water is the critical factor." He looked at her. "I did not tell you any of this because I did not want to burden you with my problems. I did not tell you about Clara because she is not my story to reduce to a warning. I did not tell you about Vance because I did not want you looking at me and seeing a man under siege when I was trying to be something different with you, something less defended than I usually am." The June sun was brutal. Tom Garvey, to his considerable credit, was looking with studied intentness at a point somewhere above the horse's ears and giving no indication of hearing anything. "That is why you didn't tell me," Mary said. "Yes." But you understand, she said slowly, carefully, that not telling me left a space in which other people's versions of events could fill the silence. Yes, he said. I understand that now. I should have told you. I was protecting things that didn't need protecting from you. He looked down at the road for a moment and then back at her. I have spent a long time being careful, he said, being closed. I have told myself it was because I had things to protect and people who depended on me and I could not afford to be exposed. And all of those things are true, but none of them are the real reason. She waited. The real reason, he said, is that being known is a risk, a specific kind of risk that I have never been prepared to take. Because if you show someone the whole of what you are and they leave anyway, then you know with absolute certainty that the leaving was about you. And that certainty is something I have not been willing to face. The desert wind moved across the road, dry and warm and carrying the faint smell of sage. I know something about that specific fear, Mary said. I know you do, he said. A man left me at the altar, she said. In Cincinnati, 3 years ago. He sent a note by his manservant on the morning of the wedding saying he had changed his mind. I had given him 2 years. I had believed every beautiful thing he said, and I have spent every day since asking myself whether I should have seen it coming, whether I was the kind of woman that men eventually leave. Frederick Holloway looked at her with an expression that was so carefully controlled and so evidently not controlled at all that it undid something in her chest. You are not, he said. You cannot know that, she said. I know that I am standing in a road in the June heat having stopped a wagon, he said, because the idea of you leaving this valley without knowing that I am telling you the whole truth of who I am is more frightening to me than anything Silas Vance can threaten. That is what I know. There was a very long pause. Mary Monroe looked at Frederick Holloway standing in the road with the desert behind him and the mountains in the distance, and the full Arizona sun on his face and the absolute honesty of his expression. And she felt the fear that had been running her for 3 years, the fear of trusting the wrong person, the fear of the vestibule and the note, and the particular silence of a church that had been full of expectation and emptied of its central purpose. That fear was still present. It did not disappear. It was not the kind of thing that disappeared based on one good conversation in a road. But there was something else present too. Something that had been building for 11 months through December roof repairs and January dinners and February poetry and March hawks and the whole long accumulation of small, real things, and that something was not a feeling that could be constructed by a man with hidden motives. It was too specific, too consistent, too entirely itself. Tom, she said, without looking away from Frederick. Tom Garvey, who had been sitting very quietly through the whole of this and deserved significant credit for it, said, "Ma'am, you can go back to town," she said. "I'll collect my trunk from you later." There was a pause. Then the very specific sound of a young man trying very hard not to express an emotional response to something. "Yes, ma'am," Tom Garvey said, and he turned the wagon around with admirable efficiency and headed back toward Callan's Creek. They stood in the road. "I need you to promise me something," Mary said. "Anything," he said. "No more buried things," she said. "Not between us. Whatever it is, whatever the cost of it, you tell me. I am not a person who needs to be protected from the truth. I need the truth. That is what I need from a person I trust." "I know," he said. "I promise." She looked at him steadily for another moment, and then she stepped down from the road's edge carefully, and he moved to give her his hand, and she took it, and they stood in the road together in the June heat. And it was, for all its simplicity, one of the most significant moments of either of their lives. They walked back to Hollow Creek Ranch along the road and through the gate and up the long lane to the ranch house, and at no point did he let go of her hand. What followed was not immediate transformation but something more real and therefore more valuable, incremental, honest change. Frederick was not, by nature, a person who opened easily. But he was, by nature, a person who kept his commitments, and the promise he had made in the road was a commitment he took with complete seriousness. When Silas Vance's attorney sent a formal letter in early July threatening legal action over the South pasture, Frederick came to Mary and told her every detail before he went to his own attorney. When he received word that his brother Daniel, who had been living in Flagstaff, had lost his job at the lumber yard and was in some financial difficulty, he told Mary about it before he rode up to help him. He practiced telling her things that were uncomfortable with the dogged, deliberate attention of a man working on a skill he has identified as critically important. And Mary, for her part, learned to ask directly for what she needed rather than waiting to see if it was offered. She had spent years being a self-sufficient woman in the sense of not asking, which was not the same as the real self-sufficiency of knowing clearly what you want and communicating it. She told Frederick when she felt uncertain about something. She told him when the memory of Cincinnati surfaced, which it did less and less frequently, but still did, and he listened with the quality of attention that was his particular gift, that full, unhurried listening that made a person feel genuinely received. They were not formally courting. Neither of them called it that. But they were together in the ways that matter, present to each other in the daily fabric of their respective lives. And the town of Callan's Creek, which noticed everything, noticed this with a collective satisfaction that found expression in a great deal of nodding and exchanging of looks at the general store. August brought the resolution of the Vance matter, and it came not through the courts but through a different route entirely. It was Frederick's attorney in Tucson, a methodical man named Edward Crane, who discovered the key. In examining the recorded deeds of the South Parcel transaction, Crane found that Vance had, in 1871, signed a receipt acknowledging full payment for a separate dispute over a card debt, and that receipt, cross-referenced with the bill of sale for the land, made Vance's claim of prior interest in the parcel not merely untenable but demonstrably fraudulent. Presenting a fraudulent claim to a territorial judge was a matter of serious legal consequence, and when Crane communicated this finding to Vance's attorney, the claim was quietly withdrawn within a week. Silas Vance left Callan's Creek in September, ostensibly for business interests in Albuquerque. Dorothea Vance remained for another 2 months, and to her credit, she came to Mary one October morning and sat across from her at the schoolhouse desk and said, very plainly, that she was sorry. That her husband had told her what to say and she had said it, and she had known, at the time, that it was a constructed story designed to harm someone, and she had done it anyway because she had learned, in 15 years of marriage to Silas Vance, that the price of disagreeing with him was worse than the price of compliance, and she was not proud of it. Mary looked at Dorothea Vance for a long moment. She thought about hidden motives and the damage they do. She thought about what it meant to be a woman in a situation where compliance was not a choice, but a survival mechanism. She thought about the complexity of moral responsibility when freedom is constrained. She said, "I am sorry for what your life with him has been, and I accept your apology." Dorothea left Callan's Creek the following month to go to her sister in Santa Fe, and Mary thought of her occasionally afterward with the specific compassion that belongs to situations where a person has been both wronged and has wronged, and where the clean lines of villain and victim don't hold. October in Arizona was extraordinary. The heat broke and the light went golden, and the desert bloomed in the aftermath of the summer rains, with a secondary flowering that Mary had not expected, and that moved her in the way unexpected beauty always did, with a kind of gratitude for being in the right place at the right moment. Frederick took her riding on a Saturday in mid-October when the light was particularly magnificent, saddling his second horse, a steady bay mare named Clover, and they rode the boundary of the ranch in the golden afternoon and the landscape spread around them, the grass green from the rain, the creek glittering, the mountains purple in the distance. And it was in this particular light, in this particular place, that Frederick Holloway said what he had been building toward for 11 months. They had stopped at the creek crossing in the western corner of the ranch, and the water ran clear over the pebbles, and the cottonwoods along the bank were showing their first yellow. And he said, looking at the water, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said, because she had learned that the best way to help Frederick Holloway say the things he needed to say was to make it clear that the saying was welcome. He turned to look at her on her horse in the October light and said, "I want to ask you to stay." She looked at him. "Not in Callan's Creek," he said. "Not at Agnes's, here at Hollow Creek as my wife. Because I have spent the better part of this year learning what it is to have someone fully present in my life who sees me clearly and doesn't look away from what they see, and I do not want to go back to living without that. I love you, Mary. I have been trying to say that for months in every way except directly, which is a habit I am done with." Mary Monroe sat on the bay mare in the October light and felt the full weight and warmth of what he had just said settle over her like something that had always been meant to be there. "Yes," she said, "I will stay. I love you too. I have loved you for longer than is probably dignified to admit." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she felt the familiar solidness of his grip and the warmth of it and the complete safety of it, which was not the safety of being sheltered from the world, but the safety of being known by someone who had chosen you with full information, which was the only kind that was worth anything. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1884, in the Callan's Creek Church. The ceremony was performed by the preacher, whose name was Reverend Good, a kind man with a slight Texas accent who had the good sense to make the service meaningful without making it lengthy. Agnes Tull was there in the front pew in her best dark dress with an expression of such complete and unsentimental satisfaction that it was better than any smile. Dr. and Mrs. Cavendish were there, and the young attorney Beaumont and Pete Carver in a clean shirt, and most of the families whose children attended the schoolhouse, and the children themselves, scrubbed and restless and in their Sunday clothes. Daniel Holloway was there. He had come down from Flagstaff, a lean young man of 28 with Frederick's gray eyes and a more open face, and he had shaken Mary's hand before the ceremony with a directness that told her he and Frederick had talked honestly about what had happened in 1871 and what it had cost his brother, and that Daniel carried that knowledge with the specific gravity of someone who has looked clearly at a debt that cannot be repaid but can be honored. Mary had told Daniel Holloway that his brother was the finest man she had ever known, and the look on Daniel's face at those words was the look of a younger brother who has spent years worrying about whether his mistakes had cost his family more than he understood, and is being told, carefully, that they have not. The reception was held at Agnes Tull's house, which was the largest private home in town, and Agnes had cooked for 2 days, and the result was extraordinary. There was dancing in the parlor, a fiddle player from the Cavendish side of things, and Mary danced with Frederick in the small cleared space, and felt the unfamiliar and entirely wonderful sensation of being precisely where she wanted to be and knowing it without qualification. Frederick danced with the concentrated deliberateness of a man who does not often dance and is applying himself to it as he applies himself to everything, and Mary laughed, which made him smile with the full version of that smile that she had first seen in its partial form on the day he fixed the schoolhouse roof, and which she had been aware, ever since, was one of the finest things she had ever witnessed. They went home to Hollow Creek Ranch that evening in the cold December dark with the stars extraordinary above the valley, and Mary Monroe, who was now Mary Holloway, sat beside her husband on the buckboard and looked up at those stars and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the particular peace of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not know they were going to, and found that it was exactly right. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was quiet and full. Mary continued teaching at the Callan's Creek schoolhouse because she loved it and because the community needed it and because Frederick, when she had wondered aloud whether married women were expected to give up employment, said, with the directness that was his primary mode of love, "I don't see why you would stop doing something you're good at and that matters to you. If you want to keep teaching, then keep teaching." She kept teaching. She also spent the winter learning the rhythms of ranch life, which were entirely different from any rhythms she had previously known. She learned to recognize weather from the quality of the western light. She learned which horses needed careful handling and which could be trusted with a novice. She learned that Frederick's pre-dawn waking was not an aberration but a permanent feature, and that the quiet hours before sunrise when they sat together in the kitchen with coffee while the ranch came to life around them were, incrementally, her favorite hours of the day. She learned that Pete Carver, the ranch hand, was a man of enormous reliability and minimal speech, and that his occasional observations, delivered in a laconic Texas drawl, were invariably worth attending to. She learned that Daniel Holloway, who began coming down from Flagstaff more regularly after the wedding, was capable of a warmth and humor that his older brother expressed differently but felt just as deeply. Spring came. The creek ran high from the snowmelt in the mountains. The grass came in thick and green. The hawks returned to the ridge above the north pasture. In April of 1885, Mary told Frederick that she believed she was pregnant. He was in the kitchen when she told him, mending a length of harness leather at the table, and he put down the leather and looked at her with an expression that was so completely unguarded, so nakedly full of feeling, that she had to look away for a moment to compose herself. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness that was nearly unbearable and said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am, in fact, wonderful." "Yes," he said softly, looking at her, "you are." She laughed and pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his arms come around her and the warmth of him and the solidity of him and the particular sound of his heartbeat, which she had learned was faster than it looked from the outside, quick and strong and present. They wrote to Agnes Tull, who came out to the ranch the following Sunday and sat at their kitchen table and received the news with a nod of complete satisfaction and said, "Good. It's time this house had more people in it." They wrote to Daniel, who replied with a letter that was 3 paragraphs of genuine joy and 1 paragraph asking whether he could come down for the birth, which was so unlike his usual brevity that it made Frederick laugh with a completeness that surprised even him. The summer of 1885 passed in the particular domestic fullness of 2 people building something together. Mary kept teaching through June and then stepped away as the pregnancy advanced, and she found, to her own slight surprise, that the time at the ranch was not empty time but full time, occupied with things she had not previously had space for. She read more. She began keeping a journal. She helped Frederick with the ranch accounts, which he had been managing himself with a competence that did not preclude a welcome for someone who was better with figures. She organized the ranch house with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had run a schoolroom, and the effect on the house's daily functioning was significant and immediately appreciable. Frederick watched all of this with the quiet attention that was his way of expressing love, and occasionally he said specific things, about a particular evening light, or the way she laughed at something the horses did, or the sound of her reading aloud to herself when she thought he was outside and could not hear, that were so entirely personal and so clearly the product of sustained, loving observation that they consistently and completely undid her composure in the best possible way. The baby was born in November on a Wednesday and was a boy. Frederick was present for the birth, which was managed by Dr. Cavendish and was, while not without its difficulties and the specific anxieties that attend such things, ultimately straightforward and successful. The boy was healthy and had dark hair and lungs that immediately demonstrated themselves to be fully operational. They named him James Franklin Holloway, after Frederick's father and Mary's grandfather respectively. He was called James, and he was from his first minutes on earth an extremely opinionated individual who made his preferences clear at high volume, and was held by his father, in the first hour, with an expression of absolute terror and absolute love so precisely combined that Mary, exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than she had words for, stored the image of it away in the permanent archive of things she would carry for the rest of her life. Daniel Holloway came down from Flagstaff. He arrived 2 days after the birth and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at his nephew in Mary's arms with the expression of a man who is being introduced to something that entirely reorients his understanding of what is important. He held James for a long time and was very quiet, and when he finally gave the baby back to Mary and went to find his brother, Mary could hear their voices in the kitchen, low and unhurried, the particular sound of two people who have been through things together and emerged on the other side of them and are, now, in a good place. December brought James's first Christmas and the first anniversary of the wedding, and both were marked with the particular warmth of a household that has arrived at a condition of genuine contentment. Agnes Tull came for Christmas dinner and brought her dried apple pie and held James with the competence of a woman who has handled babies, and said approvingly that he had good lungs and an excellent grip, both of which would serve him. The following years at Hollow Creek Ranch had the texture of real life, which meant they were not uniformly simple or easy, because real life never is, but they were fundamentally good in the way that things built on honest foundations tend to be good. The ranch prospered. The cattle operation expanded. The horse breeding program that Frederick had begun modestly became increasingly serious, the Hollow Creek horses developing a regional reputation for quality and temperament. Pete Carver stayed, invaluable and loyal, and 2 additional hands were hired as the operation grew. Mary went back to teaching when James was 8 months old, finding a woman from the community, a competent and gentle person named Mrs. Orr, to look after him during school hours. She taught at the Callens Creek schoolhouse for another 5 years, and when she finally stepped away from it in 1890, it was because the school board had hired 2 additional teachers and her role as organizer and leader had been successfully transferred, and because she had, by that point, 2 more children and a life of sufficient fullness and purpose that the schoolroom, while she missed it, was not an absence that left her diminished. Their second child, born in 1888, was a daughter, and she was named Eleanor Agnes Holloway, the middle name given with Agnes Tull's somewhat embarrassed but visibly pleased acceptance. Eleanor was from the beginning entirely different from her brother in temperament, quieter and more observant, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's capacity for focused attention. Daniel Holloway, who had been visiting Hollow Creek Ranch with increasing frequency throughout these years, met a woman in Flagstaff named Harriet Cole in 1887, a schoolteacher, which caused Mary considerable private amusement, and married her in 1888. Daniel and Harriet made Flagstaff their base but came to Hollow Creek for Christmases and summers, and the ranch in those years was full of children and conversation, and the particular good noise of a family that has grown beyond its origins. Agnes Tull remained a fixed point throughout all of it. She came for Sunday dinners and for Christmas, and for the children's birthdays, and for the annual 4th of July gathering at the ranch that had begun in 1886 as a small neighborhood affair, and by 1890 had become a significant community event, with horses and contests and food enough to constitute a genuine celebration. She watched Frederick and Mary with the satisfied observation of someone who has seen a thing through from its beginning and knows its value. In the autumn of 1891, when James was 5 years old and Eleanor was 3, Mary told Frederick one morning in the kitchen, in the early quiet hours that remained her favorite time, that there was to be a 3rd child. He received this news with the particular expression that she had now seen twice before, and that never failed to move her, the expression of a man confronting the full weight of his good fortune and being almost undone by it. "Are you well?" He said, exactly as he had said the first time and the second time, because it was always the first thing, always about her first. "I am very well," she said, "perfectly well." He took her hand across the table and held it and looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and she looked back at him, and between them was the whole of what they had built. The honest years and the difficult conversations and the trust that had been constructed carefully, on the foundation of his promise in the road and her decision to step down from the wagon and take his hand, and all the thousands of small daily choices after that to remain present and truthful and fully available to what was between them. "I never thought," he said, and stopped. "What?" she said. "I never thought when I was alone on this land," he said, "that it would become this, that it could be this." She squeezed his hand. "Neither did I. I'm glad Agnes Tull has a loud voice," he said. She laughed. "You mean you're glad she went to the ranch and told you I was leaving?" "She said if I had any business with you I had better attend to it," he said, with the expression that was not quite a smile but had been over these years increasingly close to one. "Best advice I ever received." "I'll tell her you said so," Mary said. "She'll be insufferable about it." "She already is. She's been insufferable about it since December of 1884. "Yes," he said, and this time it was the full smile. "She has." The third child, born in the spring of 1892, was another boy, born on a morning in May when the ranch was at its most beautiful, the grass deep green and the creek running clear, and the mountains still showing their winter white at the peaks. He was named Robert, after no one in particular but because it was a solid, clear name that suited him, and he was from his earliest weeks a cheerful and uncomplicated person, in ways that James was not and Eleanor was not, and this quality of uncomplicated contentment was, in a house full of complicated and thoughtful people, a gift. Agnes Tull came to see Robert when he was a week old and held him and looked at him carefully and said he had a good face and would likely not give them the difficulties the other two were going to give them, which was accurate as it turned out. Agnes Tull died in the autumn of 1893 at the age of 68, peacefully and in her own bed and on her own terms, which was entirely consistent with how she had lived. Mary sat with her in her last days and held her hand and talked to her about the things she had meant to her, and Agnes said, with the particular dryness that survived everything, "You arrived in Callan's Creek looking like a woman who'd survived something difficult and was not going to mention it. I thought you'd do all right." She paused. "I was correct." They buried Agnes Tull in the Callan's Creek Cemetery on a clear October morning with the whole town present, because Agnes Tull had been present for the whole town in one way or another for 30 years, and Frederick stood beside Mary at the graveside and held her hand through the whole of it. And afterward, when the others had gone and the October light was going golden over the valley, they stood at the grave for a while longer, just the two of them, because Agnes deserved the time. Mary cried quietly, and Frederick held her without saying anything, because he had learned over these years that sometimes the right response to grief was not words but simply presence, and he was, when it came to presence, without equal. They walked home across the valley in the last of the October light, the ranch visible in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where Mrs. Orr had stayed with the children, and the creek glittering in the late sun, and the horses moving in the far pasture with the easy grace of good animals well cared for. "She mattered," Mary said. "Yes," Frederick said. "I would not have stayed if she hadn't gone to you that morning." "I know." "Then I owe her a great deal." "We both do." They walked on through the October afternoon, and the valley held them, and the ranch ahead was lit warm and golden, and in it were 3 children and a life that had been built on truth and choice, and the particular courage of 2 people who had each been hurt and had each decided, against the evidence of their previous experiences, to try again. The years after Agnes's death were the years of the children's growing, which was its own kind of fullness. James was serious and curious, and had his father's physical confidence, and his mother's appetite for reading, and his own particular quality of moral seriousness that was sometimes exhausting in a small person and would, everyone who knew him agreed, serve him extremely well in the long run. He wanted to know why things were true, not merely that they were true, and he argued with the energy and thoroughness of someone who has been taught that honest disagreement is a form of respect. Eleanor was quieter and in some ways more formidable, She observed everything. She formed opinions that she offered sparingly but that were, when offered, remarkably complete and accurate. She loved the horses with the deep, specific passion of someone who has found their particular calling early. And by the time she was 10 years old, she was already assisting her father with the horse breeding program, with a competence that was not performative but real. Robert remained Robert. Steady, warm, easy. The person who made peace between his siblings and who could be relied upon to find the generous interpretation of any situation and offer it to everyone involved. He also, to everyone's delight, demonstrated an extraordinary talent for the violin, an instrument that Frederick located for him in Tucson on a trip in 1898, and for which they found a teacher, a Spanish-born musician named Señor Reyes who had settled in Prescott and agreed to make the journey to Callan's Creek twice monthly. And the sound of Robert practicing in the evenings became one of the ranch's most characteristic sounds. Drifting through the windows in the summer and filling the rooms in the winter, Frederick and Mary, through these years, maintained what was between them with the particular attention of people who know what it cost to build it. They talked every day, really talked, about the ranch and the children and the world beyond the valley and the interior things that were harder to put into words. Frederick had become, not exactly a man who opened easily. That was not his nature and never would be, but a man who had made a commitment to openness and honored it. And the difference between the two was, in practice, the difference between a person who is closed and a person who is choosing to be present, which is no small thing. They disagreed, sometimes significantly, about money and how to spend it, about the children's schooling when James reached the age at which secondary education required consideration, about whether to expand the cattle operation or focus exclusively on the horse breeding, which had been an ongoing discussion for 3 years before they arrived at a decision. They disagreed with the honesty of two people who trust each other enough to be in conflict without catastrophe, and they reached their decisions by the same means they reached all their decisions, by speaking plainly, until they understood each other well enough to find the path forward. In 1899, when James was 14 and Eleanor was 11, and Robert was 7, Frederick and Mary sat on the ranch house porch on a September evening in the old manor, the way they had first sat on Agnes Tull's porch, and watched the Arizona sunset turn the desert into something that, even after 15 years, Mary had not entirely learned to take for granted. James was inside studying Latin, which he had taken up with the concentrated obstinacy of a person who has been told it is difficult. Eleanor was in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal. Robert was playing the violin somewhere in the back of the house, something slow and Spanish that Señor Reyes had given him. "Do you know what I thought," Mary said, "when I was sitting on that wagon with the reins in my hands and you came riding across the flat?" "What?" Frederick said. "I thought you were going to frighten the horses," she said. He looked at her. "And then I thought," she said, "that I was going to be very angry at you for stopping me, and I was going to maintain that anger through whatever you said and then leave anyway." "You very nearly did," he said. "I know. The horses were considerably less frightened than I was." He reached over and took her hand. His hands were the same, large and calloused and certain, with the particular warmth that she had come to understand was a physical characteristic and not only an emotional one, that he ran warm, that he was always slightly warmer to the touch than the air around him, which in the Arizona winters was something she considered a definite personal advantage. "I was frightened too," he said. "I know you were. I could see it." "Could you?" "I could always see it, from the very beginning. You were frightened of the same thing I was frightened of. That was partly why I trusted you, eventually." He looked at the sunset for a moment. "Two people frightened of the same thing," he said. "Choosing to be frightened together instead of alone," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." The violin stopped. Then, after a moment, started again, something different, something bright and quick and full of joy, and the last light went over the mountains, and the valley settled into its evening blue, and the creek could be heard faintly in the distance, And in the barn Aliner's lamp was a warm yellow square in the gathering dark, and the whole of it was theirs, built and paid for and honest from its foundation, and there was nothing hidden in it and nothing buried. And the two of them sat on the porch in the cooling evening and held hands, and listened to their son play, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The story of how they arrived at this contentment was not a simple story. It ran through betrayal and hidden motives and dark pasts and forced choices, and the specific kind of trap that is built not from iron, but from the fears that people carry about themselves. It ran through a lonely rancher in a road and a woman on a wagon, and the moment when one of them spoke the truth and the other chose to receive it. It was the story of two people who had each been, in different ways, in the vestibule of their own lives, holding the evidence of their own inadequacy, and who had looked at that evidence and then looked at each other and decided that the evidence was incomplete. It was, in the end, a love story, not the kind that announces itself with soaring language and grand gestures, though it had its moments of both, not the kind that is simple or painless, because nothing real is either of those things, but the kind that is built by two specific people out of the particular materials of their specific lives, brick by brick and word by word and day by day, until what stands is something solid and warm and inhabited by people who are entirely known to each other and who have chosen, with full information and clear eyes, to stay. Frederick Holloway had stopped the wagon because he could not let her leave without knowing the truth. The truth had turned out to be larger than either of them had anticipated at that moment in the June road. It had turned out to be the truth not just of what he was hiding, but of what he wanted, and what she wanted, and what two frightened, brave, complicated people could build if they were willing to say the whole of it and mean it. In the autumn of 1901, Frederick and Mary Holloway marked 17 years on Hollow Creek Ranch. James was 16 and studying history and mathematics with the intention of eventually reading law in Tucson. Aliner was 13 and had become, as Senor Reyes said with genuine respect, as accomplished a horsewoman as he had seen in the territory, and the Hollow Creek breeding operation under her young watchful eye was producing animals that commanded serious prices from buyers as far as New Mexico. Robert was 9 and playing the violin with a sweetness and skill that made Senor Reyes say regularly, with the expressiveness of a man from a musical culture, that the boy was a gift. On the morning of their anniversary, Frederick gave Mary a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, a new edition, bound in dark green leather, which she recognized immediately as the book they had discussed at the Cavendish dinner in January of 1884, the book that had led him to say the thing about the truth of what people actually want versus what they've told themselves they're supposed to want. She held it and looked at it and then looked at him. 18 years ago, he said, you asked me what truth I meant. I remember, she said. I know what I meant now, he said. I meant that what I actually wanted was a life exactly like this one. And what I had told myself I was supposed to want was to be alone and self-sufficient and never need anyone, and those two things were not compatible, and I was not honest about it for a very long time. And now, she said, and now, he said, I want the same thing I have wanted since June of 1884. I want this. I want you. Everything else is consequence. Mary Monroe Holloway held the book and looked at her husband in the morning light of the ranch kitchen, the same kitchen where they had drunk coffee before dawn for 17 years, with the children's voices beginning to be heard in the distance, and the horses moving in the pasture outside the window and the creek running in the western corner of their land, steady and clear and absolutely certain of its direction. Everything else is consequence, she repeated softly. Yes. That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me, she said. He looked faintly alarmed. Is it? It is. I'll try to maintain the standard. She laughed, and he smiled, the full version, the one she had first seen in partial form in the Callens Creek schoolroom on a December afternoon when the roof was leaking, and the stove was smoking, and a man she barely knew had come to fix what was broken, and had, without either of them understanding it at the time, begun the long process of fixing something considerably larger. She put the book on the table and reached across and took his hand. And outside the Arizona morning was beginning in all its ordinary, extraordinary beauty. The light climbing the mountains and the desert coming to color and the hawks rising from the ridge on the first thermals of the day. And inside the ranch house, the children were coming downstairs and the coffee was ready and the day was entirely, perfectly theirs.